In this video, we'll take a look at 6 thrilling games in the Scandinavian Defense, played by the best in the world, Magnus Carlsen, illuminating his strategic and tactical brilliance in this opening. The first opponent is Super Grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura, and he starts e4. Magnus replies with d5, the Scandinavian Defense. The main goal of the Scandinavian is to prevent white from controlling the center of the board with pawns by immediately challenging the e4 pawn, while giving black good opportunities to get a solid pawn structure. White continues with knight c3, both defending his own and attacking the enemy pawn. Black captures on e4, and white recaptures with the knight before black attacks it with knight f6. White avoids the exchange as it would allow black to open up his kingside bishop, and he instead retreats the knight to g3. This entices black to push his h-pawn to hunt down the knight. After white develops his bishop to c4, black presses on with h4, pushing the knight back to f1. Magnus carries on development with knight c6, and white reactivates his knight onto e3. Then black pushes h3, trying to open the h-file for his rook. White doesn't do any favors, pushing his g-pawn to close the position, and although black has gained considerable space, the overextended pawn could be a long-term weakness. Black follows with e5, fighting for the center while opening his bishop, and white awakens his own bishop with d3. Black's bishop c5 attacks the enemy knight, and after white develops the other knight to e2, black chops off the piece with his bishop. White recaptures developing his own bishop, but with the defense of the g4 square removed, black is then able to develop his bishop to g4, pinning the knight to its queen. Then white plays with fire, castling his king into a hotly contested kingside. Magnus lifts his queen to d7, preparing to castle on the opposite end, and white plays f3, breaking the pin on his knight while attacking the bishop. It drops to e6, challenging white's bishop, who retreats to b3, where it hopes to be captured so that the a-file can be opened up for the white rook. Black just castles long, and white drops his undefended bishop to a more secure square on f2. Black plays a6 so that after white's next move, which is knight c3, looking to reactivate the knight in the center, black can capture the bishop on b3, and even though white can recapture getting the open a-file, there isn't much for the rook to look at besides a well-defended pawn. Magnus centralizes his rook, getting his final piece into play, and white jumps his knight onto e4. Black takes it, and white recaptures, gaining a central pawn that reinforces his control for the center. Then black plays f5, challenging the pawn and setting a trap that white falls for. White captures it, giving black a weak isolated pawn. But black has a wonderful way to win the game. Can you find the checkmate in 3? With white's e-pawn out of the way, there is a decidedly delicate diagonal directed at the white kingside. The move Magnus plays to exploit this is queen d5, and white, in utter disbelief, has no choice but to resign the game. Black is threatening a checkmate on g2, and there is absolutely no way to stop it. To delay things, white can move his queen to f3. Black would take it, and white's next move would not matter. Checkmate on g2 would be inevitable. The next opponent is Super Grandmaster Nepomniachtchi, and he meets the Scandinavian Defense with a pawn capture. Magnus recaptures, activating his queen right away, and white attacks it right away while developing his knight. The black queen drops to d6, and white plays d4, advancing in the center. Knight f6 is followed by knight f3, and black plays c6, starting a duel for the d5 square to prevent white from pushing the pawn there. White develops his bishop to c4, and black's bishop g5 pins the knight to the queen. White develops the bishop to e3, solidifying his pawn, and black follows with e6, opening his bishop. h3 asks the question to the black bishop, who retreats a square, keeping the pin intact. White breaks it, however, on the next move with g4, and black drops the bishop to yet another strong diagonal, where it glares fervently at white's queenside. With his kingside pawns extended, white lifts his queen to e2, hinting at a queenside castle. Magnus proceeds development with knight b to d7, preventing white from jumping his knight to e5. White castles long, which lines up the rook to the enemy queen. Black develops his final minor piece with bishop e7, and white jumps his knight to e5, sacrificing a pawn. This is because black can take the knight, and once white recaptures, black can take the pawn with his queen. Still, not only did white get an open file for his rook, after f4, which comes with tempo, we see white has a promising attack on the king side. Black retreats his queen to c7, and white slides his rook over to f1 to support an f5 advance at some point. Magnus shifts the attention to the other end of the board with b5, kicking the bishop who goes to b3. b4 gains more queenside space while kicking the knight to a grim square on the rim. Then black castles, unafraid of the incoming storm that rages on with h4. In anticipation of further pawn pushes, black gets his bishop out of danger onto e4. In response to g5, black saves his knight, hopping it to d5, where it attacks the bishop. White saves it, moving it to d4, where it stares down the black kingside, while opening the queen's attack on black's bishop. Black drops it a square to the now available f5. Now white's pawn is under attack, and he'd do best by defending it. Instead, he shows no restraint and rushes the attack with h5. Magnus grabs the free pawn with an attack on the queen, who moves, counterattacking the knight. With the base of the pawn chain collapsing, black grabs the second pawn with his bishop, defending his knight, and threatening to move the knight to a square that defends the bishop in order to pin the queen to its king. So white quickly gets his king off the diagonal, and black slides his rook to the open d-file. White plays bishop e5, forking the knight and queen, and it seems like black is in trouble. First he exchanges rooks, giving check, and white recaptures. Then black has one move here to keep his advantage, and it's important that black finds it. Can you find black's winning move? Now the knight and queen are under attack, but the queen doesn't need to move. The move Magnus plays to keep his edge is knight d5, attacking the enemy queen not once, but twice. Were white to take the black queen, then black would take white's queen right back, and we'd end up in an endgame where black would be up 3 pawns. So white sidesteps his queen to d4, creating a battery aimed at g7, and black swings his queen over to e7. White is able to win back 1 pawn, and even though it's the heart of the black king's shelter, black's king is doing just fine with all of his pieces around to defend. Black swings his rook over to d8, indirectly hitting the queen, and white sadly can't even move her, because either the bishop would hang, or the queen would go to e5, after which f6 would cut her defense off. So white plays h6, defending his bishop. Magnus starts cleaning up with knight c3 check, opening a discovered attack on the queen. White takes the knight, and black picks up the queen, before white recaptures, getting a rook and knight in return. After black plays bishop f6, hitting both the bishop and rook, which would force a bishop exchange, white decides that it's time to resign. After white would take the bishop, black would recapture with the queen, and even if white were to take the pawn on b4, black would take the pawn on h6 next, since white would have had no way to defend it. Black would then be up not only a queen for a rook and knight, but 2 pawns on top of it, which is a decisive material advantage. Hikaru's back for game 3, and he meets the Scandinavian again with knight c3, hoping for a better outcome than last time. This game follows a similar start to their first game, with black capturing the pawn, the knight recapturing, and black challenging it with his own, before hunting it down with his h-pawn after it retreats. White brings out his bishop, black kicks the knight back, and this time immediately pushes h3, prompting white to close the kingside pawn structure. After that, the game transposes back into its familiar path, with black's knight developing and white's reactivating before black pushes forward in the center. White's d3 is followed by bishop c5, and last time white developed his knight to e2, allowing black to capture the other knight before playing bishop g4 to pin the knight to its queen. This time white develops his bishop to d2, but with no white knight to battle for the d4 square, black's knight jumps right into a powerful post in the center. White follows with knight f3 to challenge the knight, but black plays the tricky queen e7, planning to meet the knight's capture with a pawn recapture to attack the would-be pinned knight to its king by the black queen, and then win it. White instead plays c3, kicking the knight, who captures on f3, allowing white's queen to develop by recapturing. In wanting to move his bishop freely without worrying about the b7 pawn, black plays c6, blunting the queen's diagonal, and then white castles his king to safety. Magnus captures the knight on e3, removing the defense of the g4 square, and although white should probably recapture with the queen, he takes back with the pawn, getting an open f-file. Still, this allows black to develop his bishop with tempo, attacking the queen, who flees to f2. e4 comes next by black, and were white to capture the pawn, then black would take back, and the pawn on e3 would be very weak in the long run. So white pushes d4, locking the position, but allowing black to fasten his bishop onto f3, anchored by the mighty e4 pawn. White challenges the bishop right away, and black counters with knight g4, hitting the queen, pushing her back to e1. Magnus lifts his own queen to f6, hoping for white to capture on f3 so he could recapture with the pawn, who would soon go to f2 with dire consequences. So white shifts his queen over to d1, adding an attacker to the f3 square. This entices black to take the bishop, and although both queens are hanging, the rook is more valuable than the bishop, so white recaptures. Black saves his queen before white lifts his rook to f4, where it builds pressure on both the knight and the pawn. Black is able to defend both with f5, but then that pawn becomes weak, and white follows with rook a to f1, doubling up on it. Black castles while landing his rook on f8 to defend, and white pushes c4, opening the lane for his bishop. Magnus continues cautiously with king h7, getting his king away from any potential harm, and white plays bishop b4, activating his bishop with an attack on the rook. Black dodges with rook f7 before white decides to change the makeup of the current position by capturing the knight on g4 with his queen. Black takes it with his pawn, leaving his rook behind hanging, and white snatches that. What's happened is white has a rook and bishop for the queen, which is slightly better for black, but white will argue that his dominant control over the only open file and his powerful rook on the 7th rank might give him an edge. The b-pawn is under attack, so Magnus pushes it a square to safety. White drops his bishop back to c3, indirectly adding an attacker to g7. So as a measure of caution, black swings his rook all the way over to g8, defending. White lifts his other rook to f4, building up pressure on two of black's weak pawns, and black pushes b5, since opening the position would benefit the side with more material. White shifts his rook over to e7, doubling up on e4, and after black takes on c4, white grabs the pawn on e4. Black swings his rook over to e8, offering an exchange of rooks. White takes it, which is a big mistake, because after black recaptures, white has one less defensive piece. White saves his e-pawn from the attack by pushing it, and black has one move here to take advantage of white's misstep. Can you find black's winning move? To find the move, one must notice that white's king is in a dangerous situation, and all black needs to do is put his queen along this light squared diagonal. The move Magnus plays is g5, forcing the rook either away from the defense of e4 or away from the f-file. Now white could move his rook to f2 to put up more of a fight, but black would take the pawn on e4, going up a pawn in addition to his existing material advantage. Then white's pieces would be stuck defending against checkmate, while black could continue pressing. In the game, white takes the pawn on g4, desperately trying to keep material even. But Magnus lifts his queen a square to f7, and white resigns because it's just all over. There's absolutely no way to stop the queen from going to f3, after which queen g2 would be checkmate. The next opponent is Grandmaster Erik Hansen, and he meets the Scandinavian defense by capturing the pawn. Magnus recaptures, activating his queen, and white develops with tempo with knight c3 attacking the queen. Black drops her to d6, and white plays d4, advancing in the center. After black's knight f6, white jumps his knight to b5, attacking the queen again, and she retreats all the way home to d8. Then white plays c3, solidifying his center. Black c6 kicks the knight, and with the pawn now in the way, the knight drops to a3. Black follows with e5, challenging the center, while opening his bishop, and although the pawn is hanging, were white to take it, black would exchange queens, luring the king to d1, after which knight g4 would fork the f2 pawn and win back the pawn on e5. So white develops the knight to f3, attacking e5. Magnus snatches the knight on a3, damaging white's pawn structure after he recaptures. Then he takes the pawn on d4, giving white an isolated c-pawn once he recaptures with the knight. Black castles his king to safety, and white develops his bishop to e2, preparing to do the same. Black centralizes his rook onto e8, white castles, and black develops his knight from b to d7. White follows with bishop f4, staring down black's queenside, but this allows black to jump his knight to d5, where it hits the bishop and the pawn on c3. White clumsily drops his bishop back to d2, defending his pawn. Magnus continues advancing his pieces with knight c5, and after white lifts his queen to c2, black jumps his knight to e4, attacking the bishop and adding an attacker to the weak c3 pawn. White's bishop d3 attacks the knight, so black chops the bishop on d2. Although the pawn on h7 is hanging, white cannot take it because after the king would slide over, white wouldn't be able to recapture the black knight without losing the bishop. So white recaptures the knight, and black pushes g6, reducing the white bishop's impact on his kingside. White's rook e1 centralizing is followed by bishop d7 developing before white pushes a4, stopping black from pushing forward on the queenside. Black lifts his queen to f6, connecting his rooks, and white plays rook b1, targeting the b7 pawn. This entices Magnus to exchange rooks on e1, and white recaptures with the other rook, putting it on the open file. c5 is next, forcing the knight to move, and it goes to b5, after which the queen's eyes are opened up onto the pawn on c3. Black chops off the knight, removing the defense of c3, and once white recaptures with the pawn, black wins the white pawn, capturing with his queen to go up material. White doesn't have to exchange queens, but black's queen would be very active in her advanced position, so white captures it, and black takes back with the knight. White follows with h4, giving his king luft, and even though the h2 pawn is hanging, black should not take it because bishop c4, hitting the knight, followed by rook e7, would not only win the pawn back, but give white a very strong position. Magnus instead slides his rook over to d8, hitting the bishop, who goes to c4, defending his pawn. Black keeps the haymakers coming, with rook d4 attacking the bishop again, and white dropping it to b3 would just be met by c4. So the bishop goes all the way back to f1, and black wins a second pawn, eating it with his knight. Still, white is allowed to jump his rook onto the 7th rank. Black starts pushing his pawn to glory with c4, and white wins back one pawn. Black pushes his pawn again, and white greedily grabs another pawn. Now black was already in the driver's seat, but at this moment he has one and only one move to convert his advantage. Can you find black's winning move? There's a reason Magnus let go of all of his pawns, and it's because his c-pawn was so close to promotion. The move he plays to end the game is c2. White slides his rook over to c7, desperately trying to stop black getting a queen, and once black promotes his pawn, white takes it off the board. Black grabs the rook, and what's happened is black went up a full rook for a pawn, which is too large a material advantage. So white throws in the towel and resigns the game. The penultimate opponent is FIDE master Kirill Bxe3, and he meets the Scandinavian defense by capturing the pawn. This time Magnus develops his knight to f6, preparing to recapture with his knight instead of his queen. After white develops his knight to f3, however, black fools us all by capturing the pawn with his queen. White plays d4 and black's bishop g4 pins the knight to the queen. Then white develops his knight with tempo, attacking the queen, who slides over to a5, pinning the other knight to the king. h3 asks the question to the bishop, who drops back to h5, maintaining the pin on the knight. White's bishop d2 breaks the queen's pin, while setting up potential discovered attacks. So black plays c6, not only fighting for the d5 square, but giving his queen a diagonal on which to retreat. White's bishop c4 is met by e6, blunting the diagonal while opening the bishop. Then white castles his king to safety. Magnus develops his knight from b to d7, and white lifts his queen to e2. Black drops his queen back to c7, out of any potential danger, and white shifts his rook from f to e1. Black's bishop d6 creates a battery aimed at the king side, and white, noticing his bishop is staring at concrete, drops it back to d3, where it has more scope. Black castles queenside, tossing the game into sharp territory with opposite sides castling, and white immediately sends his a-pawn marching forward. Black propels his bishop to h2 with check, and the knight is still pinned, so the white king shifts to the corner, where he has slightly less squares to move to. Then black returns his bishop to f4, offering an exchange. White doesn't want to trade, as it would activate the black queen. He also doesn't want black to take the bishop, because then the queen would recapture, surrendering defense of the knight, which would allow black to capture the knight and damage the kingside pawn structure. So white lifts his bishop to e3, where the queen could recapture it, without losing defense of the knight. Magnus jumps his knight to d5, adding an attacker to the bishop. This entices white to capture the knight, allowing Magnus to recapture with the pawn and get an open e-file where a black rook could target the vulnerable queen. In wanting to move his queen, white finally breaks the irritating pin with g4, pushing the bishop back to g6. Then white shifts his queen over to d2, adding an attacker to the bishop, who drops back to d6, keeping an alert eye on the white kingside. White, sensing some potential danger down the h-file, moves his king to g2. Magnus maneuvers his knight to f6, looking to jump forward, and after white leaps his knight onto e5, black does similar, moving his to e4, where it attacks the enemy queen. White's queen doesn't have a safe square to go on the queen side, and she doesn't really want to move back to e2. So white just chops off the enemy knight. Black recaptures with the pawn, gaining substantial space on the king side, and white lifts his queen to c3, where she can bolster a queenside push. Black's f6 attacks the knight, and it should probably go to c4, but white decides to grab the bishop. This gives black the open h-file after he recaptures, which is bad news for white. On the other hand, white advances his queen to c4, where she threatens to jump into e6 with a dangerous check. Magnus calmly shifts his king to b8, but white presses on with a5. Black's a6 stops any further advance, and white plays c3, solidifying his center. What white should have done last move, however, was play d5 to break down black's queenside while opening his queen's attack on the e-pawn. He missed that, and now black has the chance to play f5, not only defending his loose pawn, but threatening to keep pushing forward. White plays d5 now, but it's a move too late. Black pushes c5, closing down the queen side. White's b4 is a last attempt to create complications, but black just pushes f4, hitting the bishop. Even if white were to take the pawn, attacking the bishop, black would just take white's bishop, and white wouldn't be able to move the pawn because it's pinned to the queen. So white grabs the pawn on c5. At this point, it's all over for white, and black has a way to end the game. Can you find black's winning move? Black's pieces are peering menacingly at the frail white kingside, and the move Magnus plays to mold a mating net is f3. The king in check goes to g1, so that after black takes the pawn on h3 with his rook, the h1 square is defended. Still, white's in a lot of trouble, as the bishop cannot move because it's pinned, and black's going to take it, opening his queen to jump onto h2 with a checkmate soon to follow. Worst of all for white, there's nothing he can do to stop this. Dropping the queen to f1, for example, attacking the rook, would allow black to play the spectacular sacrifice, rook h1. White would be forced to capture, after which black would slide the other rook over to h1 with check before grabbing the bishop, establishing the aforementioned queen h2 checkmate threat. In the game, white takes the pawn on e4, and Magnus grabs the bishop, impelling white to resign the game, as he sees no way out of this mess. Even if he were to move the queen to e5, stopping black's queen from getting to h2, black still has the other option of sliding his rook over from d to h8, creating a new unstoppable checkmating threat of rook to h1. The final opponent is Grandmaster Rauf Mamedov, and he meets the Scandinavian defense by capturing the pawn. After Magnus recaptures with the queen, white attacks her right away with the knight, and she drops to d6. White's d4, fighting for the center, is met by knight f6 developing, and white follows suit with knight f3. Then black plays a6 to prevent the white knight or bishop from going to b5. In aggressive fashion, white hops his knight forward to e5, and black challenges it with knight c6. White captures it so that after the queen recaptures, he can play d5, gaining substantial space with tempo. The queen returns to d6, and white develops the bishop to c4, supporting his advanced pawn. Black's b5 kicks the bishop back to b3, while opening the square for his own bishop. He fianchettos it next, and white, unafraid, steps his queen to f3 into the leering eyes of the enemy bishop, in order to support his own bishop onto f4. In wanting to weaken white's defense of d5, Magnus pushes b4, attacking the guardian knight. White counters with bishop f4, attacking the queen, and black plays the clever e5, hitting the bishop right back. Were white to capture en passant, the bishop would chop white's queen, and after white would take the black queen, and both sides would recapture, black would be able to take the knight, emerging up a piece. So white hops the knight out of harm's way to e4, hitting black's queen for a second consecutive time. Black grabs the knight, and white recaptures with the queen, pinning the pawn to the king. Despite the weakened queen side, black castles long, getting his rook onto the open d-file where it builds up pressure on d5. Meanwhile, with the king out of the pin, white has to save his bishop, and it drops to e3. Magnus takes d5, going up a pawn with an attack on the queen. She slides over to g4, giving check, and black blocks while offering a queen exchange. With black's king in a suspicious situation, white declines the trade, retreating the queen to e2, where she targets the weak a6 pawn. Black develops his final minor piece with bishop e7, and white castles kingside, setting the stage for a sharp battle. Black fearlessly lifts his king to b7, guarding his pawn, so that if he decides to capture the bishop, giving white the open a-file, his pawn would be defended. Then white swings his rook over to the open d-file. Now black is up a pawn, so he begins exchanging pieces, first capturing the bishop on b3, and after white recaptures, getting the open a-file, black snatches the rook on d1. White could take back with the queen, but black would be able to play rook d1 with tempo. So white takes with the rook. Magnus continues to offer exchanges with rook d1, and white surrenders control of the valuable open d-file, returning his rook to a1. Black presses forward with f5, and white stops further advances with g3. Black's g5 shows relentless aggression, and white begins advancing on the opposite end with c4. Black moves his queen over to c6 to support the f-pawn's potential advance to f3. White follows with rook a5, attacking the e-pawn, and black pushes f4, attacking the bishop. It drops to d2, and black moves his bishop to c5, not only peering the enemy king, but cutting off the white rook's attack on the pawns. White takes a defensive stance and drops his bishop to e1. Magnus places his pawn firmly on f3, attacking the queen. While she could go to c2, black would have a promising attack after first playing king b6 to kick the rook away, and then playing e4 to cut off the white queen's vision. This would be followed by queen to e6, threatening to go to h3, while also supporting the e-pawn to continue advancing, breaking down the black king side, and maybe even pushing for promotion. In light of this, white grabs the pawn on e5, and black has a way to win here. Can you find black's best move? Now rook d1 is also a good move, but the line is far more complicated. The simplest way to win is to notice the queen and bishop on the same file, and the move Magnus plays to exploit that is rook e8, skewering the two pieces. White, seeing no way out, resigns the game. White can't even move his queen to capture the bishop because the white bishop's capture on the back rank would come with checkmate. White has nowhere to move his queen that still defends the bishop, so his only option would be to capture the bishop on c5 with his rook, and once black would take the queen, white would take it back with the rook, going down material in the form of a rook and bishop for the queen. It wouldn't stop there because black would swing his queen over to h6, threatening a checkmate that would be very hard to stop. I hope these games were both entertaining and instructive. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chess content.